Hello students, welcome to E-Pathashala. I am K. Muralidhar from South Asian University in Delhi. I am an honorary professor and a J.C. Bose National Fellow. Today, I am going to talk about human biology from the paper Introductory Biology. What do we learn at the end of this lesson? The learning outcomes as listed here. At the end of this module, one could be able to realize that humans exhibit self-consciousness unlike any other form of life. Appreciate the difficulties in studying human-specific phenomena as the observer and the observed are the same. Appreciate the fact that insofar as principles are concerned, whatever we learn from other forms of life is equally true for humans. Understand that in addition to not doing differently for what other organisms do, humans do some activities which are different from what other forms of life do. Realize that human behavior is unique in certain aspects, that is, different from animal behavior or plant behavior or microbial behavior for that matter. Realize that human cognitive abilities, including articulation and social behavior, are a very complex phenomenon. Understand that there are constraints in conventional experimentation methods and hence they cannot be applied to study humans. Appreciate that deeper ethical questions arise with regard to study of human behavior. Appreciate, however, that human biology bridges natural sciences and social sciences and requires special methods, including qualitative methods, to investigate humans. Let's first introduce this paper. Biology is, like physics, works with models. Models are accepted by the majority of scientists as representing the reality, although they are only surrogate objects of study. For example, a major part of biochemistry or molecular biology has come from study of Escherichia coli, a bacterium. Most of reproductive biology studies are done with Chinese hamster. Most of genetic studies are done with either the fruit fly or the zebrafish or the fungus Neurospora crassa. Most of studies on aging are undertaken on nematodes like Caenorhabditis elegans. Molecular mechanisms underlying most physiological and behavioral processes are same in humans and any other organism, including the model organisms. Modules 3 and 4 gave us an idea of what do organisms do. Living organisms grow, that is, increase in number and or size, volume, reproduce, move from place to place, except of course the higher plants, take up things from environment, are able to chemically modify whatever is taken up, derive energy from complex dietary components by reducing their complexity, excrete toxic products out of their body, etc. In any one of these basic physiological and behavioral functions, the mechanistic details are same whether it is E. coli or elephant. There are two ways of studying biology. One way is to describe the differences among organisms in structure and or function. The second way is to look for similarities. Mechanistic studies emphasize the latter. Evolutionary studies emphasize the former. Evolutionary studies emphasize change in the structure function of populations over a period of time, while mechanistic studies emphasize the unity amidst the apparent diversity. When it comes to human biology, both approaches are relevant as certain physiological behavioral processes are unique to humans. Diversification without speciation is highest in humans. It is not very clear whether cultural evolution has overtaken biological evolution or not in humans. The future of human race is a matter of lot of scientific fiction. Now, till now, we have tried to understand basic principles of biology, both structure and so-called function. Now, if we apply this information to understand human biology, we not only find that the same principles are operatable, but we also encounter newer problems. A human body, therefore, contains a coordinated number of tissues which coordinate in their functions, and therefore systemic regulation becomes an important feature, especially if you are looking at higher functions which human beings exhibit, like self-awareness or self-consciousness, or ability to think abstract ideas. These are all something characteristic of higher primates like human beings, and therefore not only basic biological principles which we have learnt in other lessons, but newer biological principles which we do not understand very well are applicable to human beings. Therefore, in one line, the function of human being or a human body is a coordinated, regulated functions of all its component tissues and organ systems. And that is what is required or stated in this slide. And hence, if we summarize human biology at two levels, one is the study and understanding of human biological organ systems and tissues, and the second is study of human higher functions like abstract thinking and many other social interactions including behavior. Here is one of those so-called organ systems depicting brain. As most of you are aware, human brain is the most important cognitive tissue, and it is present enclosed in a skeleton which we call as a skull, and this brain coordinates and enables us to perform a number of functions. Primary of them are essentially what we call as sensory functions, because we are capable of sensing certain things, as we will see in the next slide. Biologists, especially people who are called as neurobiologists, have tried to ask a simple question as whether different brain mediated functions can be linked to certain specific areas of this brain. Indeed, such experiments have shown that if you take functions like smell, speech, taste, or any such things, locomotion, language, speaking, memory, immune response, any function, one can relate it to specific area in the brain. Brain contains definitely neurons or major types of cells. There are other types of cells which are equally important, but we will not discuss them. And these are arranged in certain groups, and therefore when we talk of a brain region, one should know that we are talking about a three-dimensional region, and therefore mapping a particular function in a particular, linking it to a region of a brain is not an easy job, but it has been done, and this people do with what is called as a fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging system. And some of those examples are depicted in this slide. This essentially means that if a specific region of a brain is damaged naturally or artificially, a specific biological function linked to that is also inhibited or damaged. For example, people who are blind due to neural damage will find that there is an anatomical basis of their blindness. Similarly, those who are hard of hearing, not the external type but basically neural damage type, this so-called auditory region is found damaged. Similarly, there are people who are colorblind. Similarly, there are people who are not good in speaking or picking up a language. So all this kind of functions, when they are related to specific regions, we learn that damage to that region essentially results in damage to that particular function. What is important to note that clinical studies have indicated that in some cases the damage is there in one function, but it results in exhibition of another function. There are people who see numbers but then recognize them as colors, which is very peculiar, but these cases have been recorded by a very number of clinicians, especially by an Indian called V.S. Ramachandran, who is in California. This is one of the brain images to indicate that this kind of imaging can be done in vitro, of course, in slices, but in vivo by what we call computerized tomography or even MRI and all these things, where they give color codes to presence or absence of a particular chemical, and then through either fluorescence measurement or magnetic resonance measurement or any other property, you get what we call a image of a cross section of a brain. It does not mean that you take sections of the whole human being. It simply means we can construct these three-dimensional images by series of instrumentation mediated techniques. One example is indicated here. Continuing the same theme, as most of you realize, that brain essentially mediates what we call sensory perception, and these are usually listed as 5 senses. Here is an example of what we call as auditory sense, or ability to hear sound. Now, sound is essentially pressure changes in the surrounding air, and through our organs called ears and similar structures in lower organisms, these pressure changes in the air are sensed by certain structures. In our case, there is a tympanium, there are series of bone structures, and that pressure changes is essentially sent out as a neural signal to auditory regions in the brain, and that's how we construct this feeling of sound, both loudness as well as other properties of the sound. Different organisms differ in the kind of sound that they can hear. These are given in the property of sound called hertz. So human beings can hear only in a certain range of hertz. A bat can hear in another range of a hertz. Similarly, many people cannot hear anything below something or above certain sound. Not only that, sound which goes beyond a hertz level can also cause physical damage to our hearing organs. Most of us have realized by now, even children are aware, that we have 5 senses, all animal system, including human being. And these are listed as this sense of smell, sense of taste, sense of touch, sense of hearing, and sense of sight. But what people don't understand, including some scientists, that animals are endowed with 7 other senses. These are described in this slide. There is a sense of direction which is technically called magnetoception. For example, marine fish during spawning season move towards fresh water, and they should know which direction they should move. There is a sense of pain. This is called technically nociception. All organisms, barring few, have what are called pain receptors, and we understand degree of pain or intensity of pain. But there are organisms who don't have this pain receptor and therefore don't understand what is pain. Brain itself, for example, does not have pain receptors. There is a sense of balance. If you try to walk on a rope or on a building structure at the edge, we understand that we try to balance ourselves, and that is called equilibrioception. There is a sense of acceleration. If you are moving in an automobile or a train, and if there is a sudden increase in speed or velocity, we feel that in our body. That is called a sense of acceleration or kinesthesioception. We all have a sense of time that is called zeitception. What we measure as time is something that we have not understood. Although man has artificially created wristwatches or calendars, but we still don't understand how living organisms measure the progress of time. But we do have the sense of time pass. There is a sense of space. If you stand in a room and somebody else is standing away from you, you have an approximate idea of how far he is. This is called sensing the volume or size, or it's like a GPS. Your brain works in this, and this sense is unique for us. Then there is a sense of number. Although number is discussed in mathematics, we know all living organisms are capable of sensing this number, a quality which we call technically quorum sensing. Even a microbe even unicellular organisms can have an approximate estimate of how many are surrounding them. In higher animals, especially in human beings, we have learned this so-called numbers in a different way, but there is this sense of number as a common property in all living organisms. Another very important sense that human beings possess, of course many lower organisms also possess, but we possess in a greater detail, and this is the sense of sight, which means when surrounding light and falls on objects which are surrounding us, and the reflection from this is captured through our visual organ or eye, it falls on it creates an image inside the eye on particular parts of this eye, and that is transmitted to the so-called visual center in characteristically located in certain regions. And this enormous amount of physics of this and the physiology of this has been discussed and understood. We also not only have normal black and white vision, we also have color vision. Many lower organisms do not have color vision. We recognize basically three basic colors or combinations of these colors. Another great sensory organ is the one which enables us to smell, which simply means this is called olfactory signal, and the sense is the sense of olfaction. Here is a depiction of a cross section of the external organs like the nasal cavity and how these volatile molecules are sensed as olfactory signals, and these are again ultimately have to reach parts of the brain which is called olfactory center, and we get this sense. What is important here is sense is due to chemical, and therefore these are called chemoreceptors, and different organisms have developed different levels of these chemoreceptors organization. For example, dogs are known to smell more than 1000 varieties of olfaction, whereas human beings are not so richly endowed. Each of these smell is mediated through an olfactory receptor. Olfaction exhibits great diversity in organisms like dogs and to some extent in human beings. Each of the olfactory signals is received and mediated by what we call olfactory receptors. These are all called as GPCRs, or these are called G protein coupled receptors. There is a lot of information on how they smell, how they receive olfactory signals. Another great sense, one of the five senses that we have, is the ability to taste. And most of you are aware that this taste is because of our tongue, and in different regions of this tongue we have taste buds which receive and decode the different types of taste. Originally we were thinking that we have only 4 types of taste which we can distinguish, and a mixture of them. Later, because of the advent of Chinese food, which contains a chemical called monosodium glutamic acid, a 5th type of taste is also included as primary taste. So we have ability to distinguish primarily 5 types of taste, like sweetness, sourness, bitterness, and others. When you analyze human biology, especially human physiology, we are struck with one system, organ system, which we call the cardiovascular system. This essentially consists of a central mechanical pump, otherwise called as a heart, a series of canals or blood vessels which carry this blood pumped out of the heart through arteries, arterioles, and capillaries, reaching every nook and corner of our body. Subsequently, this interstitial fluid essentially is also drained out minus certain components, and that forms the lymph which comes back to the heart through certain characteristic lymphatic vessels. Similarly, the blood also from the using or respiring tissues reaches the heart through what we call as venous system. So we have this great pump which pumps the blood throughout the tissue, distributing nutrients, required gases like oxygen, and also collects the excretory material from these tissues and brings them back to the heart through the lymphatic system. The venous blood is essentially the one which goes towards the heart, whereas the arterial blood is something that goes towards the tissues. Let us know a little more about this so-called blood. What does blood contain? Blood in general is a liquid. 70-80% of it is water. However, it has got certain cells which are floating and certain chemicals which are dissolved in it. So, if you take a blood sample from a human being or any animal, let us say, and put a little bit of a calcium chelator like EDTA or oxalic acid or some other compound or heparin, we note and leave it in a test tube, we notice that the blood remains without clotting. If you don't include this calcium chelator, blood will clot and you get a clear liquid, straw yellow colored liquid in the supernatant, which is called as plasma. Therefore, blood contains cells and the remaining liquid, which is called plasma. If you ask now what are these cells, they are basically of three types: erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. So we just now came to know that blood contains cells and the liquid called plasma. And if you look at these cells, the most dominant cell type in terms of number are called red blood cells or otherwise called erythrocytes. They perform this respiratory function of carrying oxygen through hemoglobin to peripheral tissues and collecting carbon dioxide from the respiring tissues and give it back to lungs for exhaling. However, the other not so dominant in number but other important group of cells are called as leukocytes, commonly called as white blood cells. In their turn, these white blood cells, leukocytes, are divided into three groups. The first group is called monocytes, which are basically precursors of what we call phagocytic cells or tissue macrophages. The second type of groups have granules in their cell body which can be stained, and based on the staining, these granulocytes or polymorphonuclear leukocytes are subdivided into three types: basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils. In many allergic responses, as it happens during different seasons for different human beings, we notice that the count of leukocytes increase, especially the acidophils. And the third major group of blood is represented by cells which are called as platelets, which take part in clotting as well as many other important functions. It's extremely interesting to note that brain receptors to different chemicals are also represented in the blood platelets. Many a time, the clinicians look at platelets and do measurements in order to know what is happening in the brain. That is what is depicted in this slide, where we are focusing on the third major group called platelets. In terms of numbers, of course, this is not equivalent. One knows that we have approximately an average healthy person 5 billion erythrocytes per ml, whereas you have hardly 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 white blood cells, whereas blood platelets are even less than that. You must have heard from popular stories and experiences that when we are attacked by dengue virus, the number of platelets go down drastically, sometimes leading to morbidity and death. Platelets are indicated in this slide. Another major function exhibited by humans and also lower organisms is a function of respiration. But in the case of higher organisms, including humans, this respiration has a technical meaning. The process of respiration essentially occurs in peripheral tissues. But what occurs in the lungs, which represents and is indicated as a respiratory organ, is essentially gas exchange. That means lungs enable us to exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide. Peripheral tissues, where actual respiration occurs, they remove of carbon dioxide as a excretory product, and that is carried into the lungs, and when the lungs get exposed to atmospheric air, the atmospheric oxygen replaces this carbon dioxide and oxygen is bound to hemoglobin present in erythrocytes. Therefore, lungs is a great and a unique tissue organ system which we have. Inhaled air goes through trachea and reaches this final cells called alveolar cells, where this exchange takes place because the blood vessels are opposed to this alveolar membrane with close proximity. Gas exchange takes place, which also leads us to remember that lungs, because they are the only tissues which are exposed to atmospheric air, in addition to the good thing like oxygen, many a time we will get pollutants either in the form of cigarette smoke or in the form of organisms like aspergillus, and therefore many human beings exhibit these so-called respiratory allergy symptoms, very severe morbid conditions like lung cancer, which lead to more or less mortality for sure. Therefore, lungs are very sensitive tissue in terms of their sensitivity to get pathological symptoms. Another major function, in fact, the sole and the most important function that organisms exhibit, living organisms, is this ability to take dietary components, degrade them into smaller sizes, and thereby create energy for living. In the case of higher animals, including human beings, this function is called digestion, and there is an exclusive organ system carrying out this function, which we call as gastrointestinal tract. It begins in the mouth region where the food is entering. It goes through esophagus and then further into different organs like stomach, and where it is further going through duodenum, small intestine, large intestine, and then after the process of digestion, the undigested material is thrown out as excretory material or fecal matter through anus. In between, there are a lot of pourings from surrounding tissues, like for example, from the gallbladder and liver, the bile juices are poured into the duodenal region. Similarly, stomach, certain types of cells secretes acid which is poured into that. Pancreas, which is below the stomach, as you can see, pours pancreatic juice which contains bicarbonate as well as certain enzymes for digestion. In other words, gastrointestinal tract is joined by tubes which will bring specific juices from different peripheral tissues. Two examples are pancreas and gallbladder and liver. Through this help of these, the food that we ingest, in biochemistry, this is known as phase 1 metabolism, extracellular, it degraded into small molecules. We mentioned that the definition of living function or living cell is their ability to make energy from the dietary food and then use this energy to perform three types of work. One of the major types of work which we perform as human beings and also many animals is the ability to move or locomotion. For this, we call it mechanical work, which includes running, lifting, galloping, and all sorts of things. This mechanical work is mediated by the skeletal-muscular system. And here is the muscle, if you look at skeletal muscle especially, is the one which actually exists as a contractile tissues, and if you look at it molecular level, we notice that actin and myosin filaments, which are proteins essentially, slide against each other, and that's how creating the feeling of a contraction. And because of its attachment to skeletons at appropriate places, the whole organ like a leg or a hand moves with this, and if it is carrying a weight, we call it as mechanical work. So this mechanical work, which results in movement or locomotion depending on the group of organisms that we describe, essentially therefore is mediated by the muscle system or muscle skeleton system combined. One should note that locomotion is transposing oneself whole body from one place to another is characteristic of animals. Plants usually do not have locomotion in general. However, they have local movements like leaf movements and all that. When you look at animals which are capable of exhibiting locomotion, this locomotion is exhibited in different forms. There are animals which run, there are animals which walk. Of course, same animal can do all of these. Horses gallop. In all these things, skeletal-muscular system comes into picture. People have analyzed what does this muscle have. It has typical muscle cells, myocytes, and they are organized in a typical fashion. Anatomy of a muscle will indicate the detail. However, if you go down to molecular level, I mentioned that it contains certain fibers or proteins called actin, myosin, forming actomyosin complexes. Some of them are depicted in the right side portion. These actomyosin proteins slide against each other, giving rise at the molecular level an impression of contraction. One should remember that living organisms are, at least as far as we know, those who are present on this earth are subject to gravitational force. Any soft tissue will collapse under gravitational force, and therefore in higher organisms we are endowed with what we call as a skeletal system. There are two types of skeletons. There are organisms where the skeleton is outside. This is called exoskeleton. You see it in cockroaches and other lower organisms. On the other hand, if you look at vertebrates, including human beings, we have what is called endoskeleton. That means the skeleton is inside except for the skull, and on the skeleton, the rest of the tissues or body is hung like a piece of cloth. Here is therefore skeletal system, which we have more than 200 bones joined in particular shapes and other things, and these joints are also of variety. They essentially hold our soft tissues so that they don't collapse under gravity, and this along with the muscle performs all the mechanical work, including load bearing as well as walking, running, galloping and other such mechanical work. Therefore, the skeletal system contains bones, and these are organized in different regions, and of course they are all endoskeleton. There are more than 200 bones. What is important to know that similar structures are present in some of the lower fish, but the structure or the molecular structure is not the bone but what is otherwise called as cartilage. Therefore, there are what are called as cartilaginous fish, where cartilage forms the endoskeleton, and in all higher organisms this is replaced by bone in a process called ossification. Therefore, bones provide less elasticity and more rigidity. Our structures, if you look at human body structure, it is essentially endoskeleton except in one region, that is what is depicted here, where you are seeing a skull which essentially encloses the soft tissue brain. This is the only example of an exoskeleton that we have in human beings. Living organisms have structure and also exhibit number of physiological and behavioral functions. If you analyze them at the molecular level, food is taken in, digested, energy is created, and the energy is utilized for a variety of work that we do, osmotic work, mechanical work, and biosynthetic work. But a side product of all this work, which is basically metabolic reactions, will be toxic products, and we cannot afford to remain that these toxic products remain in our body, and therefore a system called the excretory system has evolved in all organisms, from unicellular to multicellular organisms or highest vertebrates. In our case, in the case of the human and some of the vertebrates, this is exclusively organized as an excretory system, and here are depicted a pair of kidneys that we have called as nephrons, and then the kidneys have got a number of Malpighian tubules. They join together, and the excretory products by an active process as well as passive diffusion process are thrown out in the along with water in the form of urine, which is finally collected in the so-called bladder, and then we void this urine, which is a reflex action and which can also be subjected to voluntary control. And this, therefore, excretory function is one of the major functions of living systems to get rid of all the toxic substances in the body. So, students, let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. General principles governing biology of other organisms can explain most of human biology also. In addition, human behavior is more complex than microbial, animal or plant behavior. To study and understand human social behavior, methods of natural science are found inadequate or limiting. Human biology bridges natural sciences and social sciences. Reductionist biology does not explain emergent properties or phenomena like mind. Thank you very much for your patience.